everybody. It's my pleasure as the host of this event to welcome Shaheen Talesh from UC Irvine, where he's a professor of law. And also a professor of sociology, I should add. What's really important about him, though, is that he has a JD and an LLM in insurance law from UConn Law School. So welcome back. He also picked up along the way a PhD in jurisprudence social policy from UC Berkeley. And he's going to be presenting today some of his work on cyber insurance, which is very much in the vein of his previous large body of work on insurance markets, where he basically takes a deep sociological / ethnographic dive into the actual practice of stuff on the ground, spending large amounts of times in training sessions and meetings and looking over, handbooks and guidances and all that stuff. And he brings, in all his work, he brings a kind of empirically based skepticism about what people say is going on. And he's like the kick the tires guy who says, well, what's really happening here? It doesn't look at all like what people say they're doing. And that's, I think, a theme. I'll leave it to him, but that's the theme of this work that he's presenting now on how cyber insurance works in practice. Before I turn it over to Shaheen, I will just say that I invite everyone back in 2 weeks to hear us sponsor Alon Rubinstein from UC Berkeley, who's going to be talking about behavioral economics and adverse selection in the commercial auto insurance industry, which should be very interesting. So, Shaheen, the floor is yours. If you have a question, I can't see everybody, so you can either chat it to me or you can raise your WebEx hand, and Shaheen has the floor for 40 minutes, and then we'll take questions. So, thank you very much for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Travis. Thank you for all you for attending. I was joking with Peter that I'm here in Irvine, California, and it's like 79 degrees right now. So I'm not trying to make everybody jealous who's on the East Coast, but it's sunny and 70. Let me share my screen because I do have some slides. And so let's see if I can get this to. So we're good, Peter?
Yeah, we're good. That's perfect.
Okay, perfect. All right. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, in general, I study how private organizations respond to legal regulations and what effect these responses have on civil and consumer rights in terms of procedural fairness and substantive justice. So typically studies of business compliance with law view laws very top down. That is, they think of law as formed and defined outside of organizations, and the role of organizations is limited to reacting to law by either complying or not complying. And I write about law from the bottom up, how private organizations actually shape the content and meaning of laws that are designed to regulate them. So I wrote a lot about this, studied it in the consumer protection context, studying automobile manufacturers' responses and how they influence, shaped, and ultimately weaken consumer protection legislation. And in the last decade, I've pivoted and imported my organizational analysis into studies of insurance law, another area of interest to me. And in particular, looking at how insurance companies play a mediating role in how organizations comply with laws and think about laws more generally. So really thinking about the concept of insurance companies as legal intermediaries. And so, early work I did on this area, studied employment practice liability insurance. I've pivoted and been studying cyber insurance for quite a while. It's led to a larger project. And so today I'm going to talk about how insurance companies in the insurance field construct the meaning of compliance with privacy laws and cybersecurity more generally among organizations. It's part of a larger book project. I'm under contract with UC Press, and so I've been working on this for a while. I've published some articles. I'm trying to get my screen to move here. Okay, so now it seems to be working. So, I've published some prior work. Now I'm sort of trying to bring it together into a larger statement about what's going on here. And so the book project is essentially a study of cyber insurance and cybersecurity and exploring some of these larger questions on the screen here. How cyber insurers manage cybersecurity and privacy law compliance among organizations, why perhaps it hasn't been that successful yet. And more broadly, in sort of the deeper insurance questions, is sort of how do insurers manage uncertainty concerning underwriting risks where little actuarial data exists, and under what conditions can insurance act as a form of regulation and insurance companies as sort of de facto regulators, right? So these are sort of the broad questions animating the project. the project also puts into conversation insurance with technology and big data and information security. As we know, governments, businesses, banks, schools, healthcare institutions, policing are increasingly turning to emerging technologies and big data. It's debatable whether these interventions, work well or are disruptive or transformative, but the pivot toward technology, I think, is somewhat irreversible at this stage. And so, although scholars are debating these issues, we lack a lot of empirical data in how insurers manage uncertainty, act as regulators, and in particular, wrestle with these issues. And from a technology standpoint, although many explore the ways that code and technology and information regulate society, existing research across many economic sectors and other aspects of society primarily focus on the theoretical and normative challenges of big data and emerging technologies. Somewhat normative, somewhat theoretical. We lack a lot of scholarship on the ground about sort of how these tools are operating and what's happening. And this isn't due to a lack of interest. I think it's due largely to the secrecy and the lack of disclosure by data providers and harvesters and corporations that collect and use these data and operate these technologies. And so, I'm trying to kind of get at that a little bit, how big data and technology influence certain aspects of society. And this is a project that's really exploring these issues in the cyber insurance and cyber security context. So they're thinking about this idea of the fusion between insurance and technology, which some refer to as in InsurTech. Now, we're looking at this, of course, in the cyber security context. As most of you are aware, probably on this call or this meeting, one of the biggest threats facing businesses and consumers are data breaches and cyber risks. This is loss exposure associated with the use of electronic equipment, um, computers, information technology, virtual reality. Breaches in the last decade have affected virtually almost every industry, from financial to healthcare, to law firms, universities, you name it. It's sort of happened, if you will. Um, Millions of records have been lost, stolen, or inappropriately, mobilized. It's very costly in terms of lost money and privacy. As a result, right, we've seen the expansion in the number and the kinds of privacy laws, regulations, and industry guidelines. Organizations are subject to compliance hurdles via HIPAA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley. States have notification statutes that require organizations to notify those affected promptly and at great expense at times. Individuals who are victims of breaches have tried their hat at suing, for tort claims or contract claims. There's been some litigation, and of course, we've seen, CCPA in California, GDPR in Europe come out. So there's been sort of a legislative response at times. Now, despite the legal, reputational, financial, and survival threats, prevailing empirical research suggests that private organizations aren't drastically changing their behavior. Organizations do have formal policies in place, but the majority of organizations do not believe they are sufficiently prepared for data breach events, haven't sufficiently devoted adequate time, money, and resources to protect consumers' electronic and paper-based information, and have failed to perform adequate risk assessments. So recognizing this under preparation and under compliance gap, the insurance field has stepped in the last decade or two and began offering cyber insurance, right? And this is insurance designed to provide both first party loss and third party liability insurance for data breach events and privacy violations and cyber attacks. And there's variation in the types of policies being offered, but insurers are offering some level of risk shifting for the costs associated with having to respond, investigate, defend, and mitigate against these kinds of incidences, if you will. And there's third party, as I said, it's both first party and third party. Organizations are increasingly purchasing cyber to deal with these risks. Whereas most companies didn't have cyber about a decade ago, the sense now is around maybe 30 to 40% now have some form of insurance trying to protect against these kinds of losses. And it's not just the risk transfer that comes with this insurance. Insurance companies are now offering risk management services aimed at improving an organization's cybersecurity profiles and hopefully reducing their risk, right? And so in this respect, cyber insurers are trying to play a regulatory role over their insureds. I've done some prior work a 2008 study that sort of mapped some of this out. I'll talk about this a little later. Um, but because cyber insurance is so new and uncertain, the cyber risks are constantly changing, the cyber attackers are constantly evolving. The insurance industry doesn't have a lot of, loss history and actuarial data like they would, let's say, in auto. Insurance industry has coveted data from data providers and pivoted toward technology. And the project tries to sort of explore this interplay. So it's exploring at a big picture level the questions on the top of the screen here, this idea of insurance and how they manage uncertainty and how insurers use technology. And then more focused on what I'm going to talk about today are certain aspects, a couple of chapters of the larger project, which look at sort of how this happens, how big data shape and influence the delivery and practice of insurance and reshape the business of insurance, and what are the effects and implications. And so I've collected a lot of data, 70 interviews with members of the cyber insurance field, an analysis of a big data set that I was able to obtain access to, analyzing insurance policies, insurance applications, attending cyber insurance conferences, just a wide variety of data. And really, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I can think of as the technologization of insurance is what we see going on here. The process whereby technology is essentially influencing and shaping the delivery of insurance. And I'll try to tease out, sort of how this is happening, the mechanisms through which insurers use technology and data and security to manage uncertain risks and regulate the behavior of their policyholders. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that all insurers rely heavily on technology, but rather those that do so in the cyber insurance field in the way that I'm going to talk about today, right? So, again, I'm just going to present a couple of slices, a couple of parts or chapters of the larger project. And I'll break it out into sort of two phases, if you will, or parts. I'll try to highlight how carriers and brokers are turning to big data, predictive analytics, and information security to assist in the underwriting, risks, and claims management processes. And then I'll talk about the effects and implications of that. Okay. Ultimately, I conclude that although reliance on technology and data are increasingly transforming the manner in which insurers deliver insurance in this space, at least for now, cyber insurers are not significantly improving the cybersecurity posture of most insureds. Once insurance is issued, most insurers do not monitor the insured's cyber hygiene. The insurer's regulatory impact so far appears to be somewhat marginal in terms of heightening the insured's cybersecurity readiness. And I'll talk at the end a little bit about some suggestions about how to maybe address some of the problems that I'm going to explore in somewhat detail in the next few moments. Now, this is also, as I said, a book project that is trying to make a theoretical contribution in addition to an empirical one. So this is sort of theoretically informed empirical research. I'm a co-editor of Law and Society Review and sort of a big proponent of this style of research. Now, existing models of insurance often think about insurance as contract, discuss the forms and functions of insurance, which can be thought of as insurance as regulation, as a gatekeeper, as a product, as a form of knowledge production, as a tool for capital accumulation and allocation, right? Often, though not always, anchored in law and economics principles in terms of understanding the behavior of insureds and policyholders, and really thinking about law as sort of top-down and exogenous to the insurance institutions that draft, market, and sell insurance. Now, I'm anchored more, as Peter noted, my PhD and my sort of expertise is more of on a sociology, political science tilt. And so I draw from new institutional organizational sociology studies of law and organizations. And I argue that sort of the relationship between law and organizations is more bottom up, right? That organizations, insurance companies, behavior, culture, and decision making can really influence not just how they respond to law, but how insurance approaches can influence how law is thought of among public legal institutions. So, and bubbling right up into how insurance regulators or judges think about what insurance law should be. And in particular, been focused on this idea of insurance companies as intermediaries between formal law on the books coming from legislators and courts and how law is implemented among organizations and individuals. So carriers, insurance companies, the insurance field plays a very critical role in this space. And so, the new institutional theory that I'm drawing upon starts with a basic premise that laws regulating organizations are often ambiguous in that they do not define the terms of compliance. And in these situations, organizations do not resist or avoid. They respond often by legalizing themselves, by creating written policies and procedures that that exude legitimacy to the public, that anchor themselves in sort of law-like behavior, and there's a legalization that takes place. And as organizations legalize themselves, managerial and business values of efficiency and rationality and discretion come to influence the way in which organizations understand law and compliance. And so this sort of filters, a law is sort of filtered through the organization's logic, whether you're talking about employers responding to Title VII, and often thinking about anti-discrimination law from an efficiency and a discretion lens, or the prison field thinking about responding to issues of prisoner rights from more of a command and control prisoner logic, prison field logic. These logics often spread through conferences, trainings, professional literatures, and eventually these logics get institutionalized as a way of thinking in a field, and then eventually they bubble up into how courts and legislatures and regulatory institutions think about law. So Laurie Edelman has done a lot of work, initial work on this area in employment law, where laws, Title VII, for example, says there should be no discrimination. Discrimination wasn't defined in 1964 in Title VII, and employers responded by creating written policies and procedures. Harassment officers, discrimination officers, they exude legitimacy, but what has been shown is often they think about anti-discrimination law through a managerial lens, and eventually it became institutionalized where basically all employers have these structures, such that now courts defer to the presence of those policies and procedures as evidence of non-discriminatory treatment. Whether, of course, it's actually working or not is an open question, but just the presence of the structure is evidence of non-discriminatory treatment. So the content and meaning of anti-discrimination law, in some respects, has been shaped by employers, the very groups such laws are designed to regulate. Now, hers was a model of judicial deference and influencing the content and meaning of court decisions. I spun off into other directions and shown how organizations shape the meaning of legislation and regulation. Now, more recently, I've talked a lot, and this slide shows you my work in employment practice liability insurance, that organizational fields don't just operate with a managerial logic. Particularly, let's say in the insurance field, they operate with a logic of risk. And so with regard to employment practice liability insurance, I've shown in prior research, it's published in Law and Social Inquiry, that insurers through conferences frame anti-discrimination law around risk. They elevate the risk and threat of the legal environment. They frame employment issues around being sued and the need for risk reduction, and then they encourage employers to purchase EPLI insurance. But in doing so, they build discretion into legal rules, and they recontextualize what anti-discrimination law means around a non-legal risk logic. So employment law becomes less about fostering a discriminatory-free work environment and more about how to avoid being sued. And so, I've been playing with this approach in various different contexts, as I'm showing here, and thinking about, again, insurance companies as intermediaries. And this project really tries to put its finger on cyber insurance, and also ultimately what my findings show is that technology, information security are mechanisms now through which managerial and risk-based logics can influence organizational behavior. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And so, this is sort of where I'm going with the project and what I'm going to present now in terms of data. So, the larger book talks a lot about the history of sort of big data and insurtech. And ultimately, on the bottom of the screen here, as you'll see, I think legal regulations in these spaces are largely weak, fragmented, and limited, right? So it starts again with that new institutional premise that, laws often regulating organizations are ambiguous. They're not strong. There's a lot of fluidity. There's a lot of room. There's a lot of discretion, right? And so then there's more of a deep dive analysis into sort of how this plays out. And so just a brief word about the methods before I talk about my findings, which I think is obviously the more fun part of the project. Yeah, as I said, I've done 70 semi-structured interviews, participant observation at conferences, where the insurance field actors come together on panels similar to the ones academics attend, content analysis of webinars, policies, applications, and analysis of big data. Did a cyber war game where we brought industry individuals together to simulate a cyber attack, and then I evaluated, so to what extent are they calling on insurance, looking to insurance to address the problem. So a lot of data collected over a period from 18 to 2020, 2018, a little bit still collecting, but largely the lion's share was then. So the findings, okay. Well, as I said, sort of lack of actuarial data history. The cyber criminals are constantly evolving. There's been a pivot toward turning to big data providers, information security, forensics companies, and predictive analytic companies. Carriers either partner with these companies or in some instances bring these tools in-house. And there's a little bit of a distinction between how sort of large organizations are treated versus small, medium entrepreneurs or SMEs. Large organizations receive a higher touch approach where it's not just about the insurance application, but there are meetings and discussions. Whereas the SMEs, I think there's been a real pivot toward relying on the security scans and sort of the information that is obtained by analyzing the cybersecurity health. And I'll talk about this a little more in a moment. Now, there are three ways in which insurers are using technology in the practice and delivery of insurance. So this is a quote, by the way, just talking. I should have probably put this slide a little earlier. There was a real discussion in the field about the concern about managing uncertainty and the need to look to technology to deal with it. And that's what these quotes are highlighting. But I'm gonna move forward. Uh, One of the ways that technology is used is big data providers are providing insurance companies and brokers with aggregate data about breaches that have already happened to similarly situated organizations. So data providers collect information on thousands of claims and losses from public records and non-public information from brokers and insurers, and then sell the aggregated information back to insurers and brokers attempting to understand the extent of the cyber market and the types of breaches that might be reasonably expected. And so, carriers and brokers, they buy this big data from data brokers in order to help develop their own pricing and underwriting models. And of course, they use this data to justify recommendations to clients. So that's one way. Second, relying partially on big data, many information security companies are focused on modeling this aggregate or systemic risk to a carrier's portfolio, right? And so this quote here is highlighting that, right? I think that there's a common language as dollars and cents and probabilities, and that's what the boardroom can respond to. If I'm an IT technical guy, I come to you and say we have 2 million botnets and 500 high severity vulnerabilities. You're a board member, you're going to look at me and say, I have no clue what that means. But if you come to me and say, there's a 1% chance that these events occur in the next 12 months, and the worst case scenario is $1 billion loss, that's a much different conversation. That's the way you can corral resources and start to actually manage the risk and manage the exposure. And so the point here is, look, technology and big data tools are sort of driving the insurance sales process by translating aggregate risk into a language that buyers of insurance understand, which is, of course, potential profits and losses. Okay. Third is less about sort of the aggregate risk. There are companies that are focused less on systemic risk, as I said, and more on individual companies looking to buy insurance, giving each a score or rating that helps underwriters determine the risk level of a specific company and whether they want to issue that insurance to that company. So they're, using scanning the dark web, they're using high-end security tools, mostly external scans, and they issue a rating or a score. So you go to the doctor, you get a cholesterol score. Well, they're going to give your company a score, a cyber hygiene score, if you will. And there are a series of companies that sort of players in the market that sort of help with this. And carriers believe that these scores help increase the efficiency and accuracy in pricing that they offer and render the insurance application somewhat less important. And so the bottom quote here is making that point. This is an underwriter basically saying it's easier, it's more accurate, it's more granular. I can set my pricing more accurately to reflect the individual risk. Um, I think the field is playing with AI. We talk about it. I talk about it a little bit so far in my project, but um, with an eye toward efficiency. I think it's developing. I don't think it's fully there yet, but I do want to say something about sort of the third I sort of big way or fourth point here is that insurers are also using these tools to engage in risk management and loss prevention. So here, I think carriers are trying to play a de facto regulatory role, right? Through the offering of pre-breach services aimed at preventing and detecting risks, and post-breach services aimed at responding in the event of a data breach attack. So on the left side of the screen are the pre-breach kinds of services that buyers of insurance can use, aimed at prevention and detection, from shunning analysis to webinars to assessments to training, various things that can help an organization avert a data breach attack or an incident, if you will. And of course, post breach are on the right side of the screen, right? Here, carriers contract with, have relationships with, bundled together. Law firms that can be accessed in the event of a data breach event. They can serve as breach coaches. Forensics investigators can identify the cause of the breach and sort of stop the breach, if you will. Um, PR is a big problem, public relations, when these events occur, and they'll give you access to certain crisis management and PR firms that can help manage the sort of public relations issues with regard to data breach events. And of course, credit monitoring and restoration. We've probably all received that in the mail at one point in our lives or another. Now, I show you this slide not to overwhelm you, although it is overwhelming, but to show you that there's a huge market share for these kinds of companies that are in this sort of pre-breach, post-breach services space, right? A lot of players, right? And they're all jostling for market share. These are the players that come to a lot of these conferences that I attended, and there's a big market for these kinds of services, both post-breach and especially pre-breach. And it's so small you probably can't even read some of it, but it's data security, web security companies, endpoint security, all these different companies. It's a huge marketing opportunity, if you will, and this plays out a lot at the conferences that I attended. And I like the slide because it sort of it captures it all in one slide in some respects. Okay, so the first part is sort of how technology has played a big role in the cyberspace. But then, of course, it's okay, what are the effects and implications, right? And so, as you can see here, I say worthy goal, but somewhat lackluster results thus far. My results suggest, at least thus far, insurtech interventions and innovations, while there may be benefits to the efficiency of the cyber insurance industry, are largely ineffective at enhancing organizations' cybersecurity. To the extent the insurers are attempting to fill this regulatory role, they don't appear to be doing so effectively. And some of this I've published previously in collaboration with Brian Cunningham. Other of it is some new information, but I'll try to give you a sort of a highlights or best hits version of what our findings are in this space. So start with the first bullet point, which was big data in the cyber insurance context is an unreliable tool. Here, many of the people we spoke to in the field and I spoke to in the field said that data is limited, not always accurate or reliable. The quality and the sources of the information are limited and paint an incomplete picture. There's too much reliance on publicly available information. And in fact, many insurance companies do not share their data with big data providers for fear of losing a competitive advantage. And this quote here, I think, highlights that really nicely, and it's something that I heard over and over, while I was in the field. And so there are problems here, as you can see, with the use of big data. And then, others talk about it as the problem being it's too backward looking. Here's a quote. Many brokers and industry leaders we interviewed critique this benchmarking approach by big data providers because it's backward looking, not reliable. And this quote is from a risk manager, a buyer of insurance here. This first quote. And they always say, give me some benchmarking. Well, I mean, I get angry when I hear that. you've got this evolving threatscape in front of you, and you're going to drive the car by looking in the rear view mirror to see what the clowns behind you are just as blind as you are doing. It's crazy. So I'd say no, benchmarking is useless. Do a ground up analysis, right? And of course, the justification for this big data is that it helps give reliable information to carriers and brokers with respect to pricing the underwriting risk. And of course, people in the field are saying it's backward looking. The cyber criminals are constantly evolving, and we need to be more sort of evolving and more elusive, more fluid, I guess is the word, than the industry currently is. Second point is careful examination of the data broker's database reveals that they often don't discount outliers of excessive loss amounts when presenting or calculating key stats. So, analysis of the various peer groups. I mentioned I had access to a big database, and the database consistently included outlier loss amounts experienced by companies in a particular peer group in its presentations of data. So in other words, the database somewhat inflates the potential costs of losses and nudges buyers of insurance to purchase more limits. Because of course, when there's a higher outlier, a visual inspection of the plots that are put out there suggests a company may experience a loss that is much higher than the average and therefore should significantly raise the insurance coverage limits on the policy and in turn, of course, pay higher premiums, right? And so, big data in the cyber context creates incentives for insurance companies and brokers to sell this insurance and enhance profits. And the databases sometimes, at least the one I looked at, serve as a tool to aid that effort, not necessarily for the benefit of consumers. And then look at the quotes that came when we talk to people about these very same databases. It's about nudging buyers toward buying higher limits. We manage the uncertainty by showing the peer data. We show them what our models generate, what third models like big data providers generate. Second bullet point, sort of nudge the client into understanding what the recommendation is. We use people to get people over the starting line to make the purchase. Clients will say, "Prove it," and we have a healthcare company with such and such revenue, and it'll spit out a chart. Here are 5 companies similarly situated to yours. Here are their limits. It'll present that graph or chart and help nudge the client into understanding what the recommendation is. Okay, and so there's some merits to that, I think, but again, people we spoke to in the field said what's on the bottom of the screen, that it's not necessarily always aligning with what people see in the industry. Our numbers are much more conservative, lower than what the data providers' numbers come at. So that's what we're seeing in the industry. Okay. I talked to you earlier about the security scans and the scoring. Well, a lot of people were pretty critical of the scans that are used by carriers as somewhat, again, limited, right? They don't tell you too much. There's too many false positives. It doesn't account for organizations who deliberately sort of put honeypots or sinkholes to draw out the cyber attackers. That when the scan occurs, that's seen as a vulnerability when in fact they're actually trying to lure the cyber criminals out, if you will, and catch them in some respects. They often don't follow up with a meeting with the prospective buyer regarding the scans that have been conducted. Carriers don't share the information with the insured regarding the cyber hygiene of the organization based on the security scan. That's a potential regulatory opportunity there to let the buyer insurers know of the vulnerabilities and to nudge them to fix their vulnerabilities. Often, many that I spoke with said they don't disclose to the buyer that they've conducted a scan or test. Rarely do carriers require changes as a prerequisite to issuing the insurance. Why? Soft market. Okay, and that was over and over what was stated in the field. And the scans, as you can imagine, are not continuous throughout the policy, but are a snapshot in time, right? Usually at the time the risk manager is trying to buy the insurance. Okay, so there are problems there. Is the bigger point here. What about those pre-breach services I mentioned earlier? Well, people we talked to in the field said there's a very low uptake rate. Organizations aren't really using these pre-breach services. Somewhere around 5 to 10% is the uptake rate on these services. So they exist. They're largely symbolic, right? They exude legitimacy, but really not making a difference, if you will. Why? Well, um, people I spoke to said that pre-breach services, many don't trust them. They're worried about maybe the price, and they underestimate the risk of cybersecurity incidents. So many people still just don't think they're going to get hacked. Many organizations just don't think it's going to happen to them. Um, Carriers seem unwilling to require insureds to adopt these services as a prerequisite to issuing insurance. Why? Soft market. Now, apparently, what I've been told more recently is the market has hardened a bit, and so that could change things. But at least when I was collecting this data, that was what we heard over and over again, right? Um, and there seems to be like carriers aren't necessarily verifying what's on the insurance application. So as to post-breach services, I think organizations are using those, especially SMEs, small, medium-sized organizations, the access to the legal services. And so that's, somewhat constructive. Of course, that's after the breach has occurred. So to the extent there's a sort of regulatory impact, that's going to be missing because the breach has already occurred, right? And so that's a challenge there. So things are not perfect. As my presentation I think is showing. So then you say, well, all right, I talked earlier about law being endogenous and organizational deference to organizational responses. So somewhat troubling. The same flawed data may be shaping the content and meaning of actual legal regulations that are intended to regulate the industry. So, for example, regulators and rating agencies are working with the very same information security companies that insurers use to develop their own rating, risk, and monitoring systems to regulate insurance companies. All right. So, I'll just walk you through this quote. You know, we work with carriers, we work with regulators. This is an information security provider talking, by the way. We work with regulators and rating agencies like Standards and Poor's, and what they've done is use some of our analytics and they've embedded them into a report that any companies and users can go out and buy themselves. And we provide benchmarks and comparisons. We work with the state regulators to come up with the frameworks for how they should evaluate cyber exposures. And so a lot of times what we've been doing is trying to couple our analytics with their processes. The regulators we work with are state insurance regulators or bodies like Lloyd's. So the people that are overseeing the insurance companies and the financial service companies, those are the regulators we're primarily focused on. And then the next sentence talks about it happening even with the NAIC. They'll have an even mini pitch session for insurance tech companies. So I'd say regulators are definitely interested and integral to the innovation. Okay. Now, so then you say, well, how to process all that? Well, I say to the extent that predictive analytic companies developed by information security providers are built upon inaccurate, unreliable, and incomplete data, as the findings I'm presenting suggest, well, then state regulators and private setting standard organizations are to some extent adopting and legitimizing a flawed model into its regulatory framework. And so, regrettably, I'd say thus far, cyber insurers are not significantly improving the cybersecurity posture of most insureds. Once the insurance is issued, most carriers are not monitoring the insured cyber hygiene. And so, even though carriers, I think, tout their role as sort of a de facto regulator in this space, their impact is somewhat marginal. And so, thinking about a possible pathway forward, right, would be to address some of the problems that I've identified in the study and in some of what's going to be in the book, right? To engage in continuous evaluation underwriting throughout the life of the policy, to reward good behavior with reduced insurance premiums. When necessary, require prospective insureds to make changes to improve their cybersecurity posture as a prerequisite to issuing insurance, to engage in dynamic risk management and loss control throughout the policy period. Um, these would sort of address the problems that have been identified empirically. And this gets to Peter's point where this is my style of research, right? Is to go into the field and see what's going on, right? To do sort of a, qualitative deep dive and sort of see what's going on the ground. And then from there, make recommendations moving forward. Now, there are some companies starting to play with this. It's not just Coalition and AppBay that I note here, but there are some insurtech companies that are trying to play with concepts like continuous underwriting, continuous scanning and evaluating the cyber hygiene throughout the life of the policy, continuous pre-breach monitoring, simultaneous risk transfer and risk management, and sort of tying premium pricing to existing risk and loss control measures. In other words, rewarding policyholders with lower premiums for heightened security. So there's some of this going on. This is a quote that is talking to an insurtech executive about how they tie premium pricing to existing risk and loss control measures, and the red language. We've changed our configuration. This is the policyholder saying, we've responded to your problems that you've identified, and can we get better terms? And most of the time they do it before they buy the insurance. So they get the first quote from us, they make the fixes, we improve the offer, and then bind the insurance, right? So there's some of this playing out. Um, there's some continuous real-time scanning going on, and here's one insurtech executive saying we're using the exact same underwriting engine at the beginning that we quote the policy. We run that engine once a month for every one of our policyholders. And when they identify problems, they try to communicate out to the policyholder to fix these problems, suggesting there's an alignment between the carrier who doesn't want to breach and the policyholder, of course, who doesn't want to breach. And so there's a potential societal impact there. Many people we talked about said that this is sort of the future of cyber insurance for all the reasons I stated earlier, right? That you have this sort of merging and blending of insurance with managed security. Now, in light of these problems, Brian Cunningham and I have written about thinking about what role does the federal government play, and I'll be talking a little bit about that in my book. Should we have a federal funded financial backstop for situations of critical risk, catastrophic risk, attacks, cyber war attacks, which are, prevalent across the world, and certainly we can expect them in the United States. And thinking about, what role the government can play in this space as a sort of federal funded financial backstop. I think the government is actively thinking about these issues. We just hosted a conference in October here at UCI, which had both industry and government officials all here to sort of talk about the concept of a government backstop. And so, in conclusion, it's a study illustrating the role of insurance companies as intermediaries, right? And I think the big finding here is insurance companies as de facto regulators isn't great so far. Why? Here are all the bullet points, right? Soft market, they're competing for market share, reluctance to reward good cyber hygiene with lower premiums, the unreliability of big data, the unreliability of the information security scans, the low uptake of the pre-breach services, et cetera, right? And so, it brings us back to some of the larger questions that I started with. Should carriers be given deference to regulate organization behavior? Many celebrate this idea of insurance as regulation. I think it's more of think of it on a continuum. Under what conditions can insurance companies act as regulators in effective ways? That's an empirical question. In the EPLI context, I've seen it as problematic. In the cyber context, I think it's problematic. That's not to say it could not be problematic in other contexts, but it's an empirical question, right? I don't think it's a yes, no, right? It's a more it depends, right? And then I've written some stuff earlier, and as I said, I'm going forward with this project and trying to bring it all together. So I think I've stayed relatively on time, Peter, and I'm going to stop.
And I appreciate that fast talking that went into that. I got a million questions, but I don't want to intrude, so I will take questions from the audience, and then if nobody wants to raise their hand, I will just ask some of my many questions. Anybody? I don't see any. All right, so let me start off. The stereotype definition of an economist is someone who, when asked, "How are you?" answers, "Compared to what?" So I guess I want to ask the compared to what question, which is like in one of those last slides, you were talking about, well, they don't really check up after they do their first cyber scan, and they don't do this and they don't do that. And you listed all these things that, you might imagine an insurance company should do. But is the failure to do that, like, maybe the snide way of asking this question is like, okay, dude, who are you to tell us what we should be doing? We have our money at stake. We have expertise. You're a smart guy, but like, why? Presumably they've made the judgment. They knew about all those things they could be doing, and they decided not to do them because they didn't think it was worth the cost or something like that. So how do you answer that? I mean, like, there might be a better world on paper, but but the people with the best information about how much moving to that world would cost have pretty much knowingly decided they didn't want to do it. Or is that just not the right way to think about this?
No, I think that's fair. It comes back to a point I made at the very beginning, which is despite all the noise about cybersecurity, the vast majority of organizations, and this is not my data collection, there are others that have done this, and show that organizations aren't drastically changing their behavior, right? So I'm coming at this from uh, a policy standpoint where the government, so we have this problem of cybersecurity incidences. The government is somewhat weak, fragmented in terms of its oversight. Okay. Organizations are underprepared, underprepared for data breach events, under compliant with privacy laws. And there's this gap here, right? From a policy standpoint. And the carriers, the insurance companies have come in and they have marketed themselves as we can help, right? We can help with our insurance. And it's not just risk transfer, it's risk management, right? And so as a researcher, the question I'm asking is, well, how does this work? Under what conditions does this work? And is it really happening, right? And so, and is the idea of the insurance company playing this intermediary role in this space working or not? And I come away saying, even though they tout this at these conferences I attend, I don't think it's working very well, and here's why, right? Now, not to say it couldn't work in a different context. I think insurance companies have played a regulatory role in other contexts in a somewhat effective way. But there's a lot of people in the legal academy, as you know, Peter, that's I think tend to celebrate the insurance as regulation concept. And I think my response is I'm writing against that to say, hey, before we celebrate it, let's go and see how it works on the ground. Tom Baker did a great study with Sean Griffith on DNO. And of course, as you know, their finding is, hey, despite having opportunities to engage in loss control and loss, but they just don't do it, right? EPLI, my conclusion was they have opportunities to do it, and they do it. They just do it in a really bad way that reframes anti-discrimination law around less about fostering a safe workplace and more about avoiding being sued. And in this case, as you can see, they're using these tools and they're trying to get at the issue, but I think it's falling short for a lot of the reasons that I think I identify on that final slide of problems, right? So the devil's in the details of to what extent can private industry play a regulatory role. The carriers, the insurance industry certainly touts this. And I think my intervention is to say this is what's happening on the ground, and I think it's something far from ideal yet.
Great, great. Okay, so Sasha had a question, and then I'll take others if you want. Sasha, you're on.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Shaheen.
Hello.
Hey, Sasha.
You made a couple claims that I want to push back a bit on. One is that firms are underprepared, they're underfunded, they don't understand the risk, and really something should be done about that. There's an alternative story, which is, look, firms are rationally investing their privately optimal level of security controls. They're doing what they need to do. They are informed, and they are managing cybersecurity like any other enterprise risk. And breaches will happen because breaches will happen, just like any other operational risk or operational accident. And so it's hard to separately identify those two realities of whether or not firms don't understand and are underinvesting, and therefore that's why breaches happen, versus they're doing everything rationally and investing appropriately, and therefore breaches happen. And I haven't quite reconciled how to figure that out, and I don't know if you have if you even need to for the purpose of your book.
Yeah, no, I would probably say, it's not the research question I'm asking, right? So I probably don't need to. I try to, and I try to do this in my opening 5 minutes of my presentation, try to frame the world as I entered it, right? Which is, I'm not saying that I think there's data to suggest that many organizations are underprepared and undercompliant. I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing. That's just what the world is. I think there's somewhat consensus that law in the privacy law area and the cyber area is largely I think, weak and fragmented and not sort of where it could be. I think there's some, and so it's in this space that I'm entering the conversation. I think the one point I would, I don't know, I want to say pushback. I'd say maybe like gentle bump as opposed to pushing. Would say that, to the organization that, is, you're saying there could be sort of this rationally optimal investment of security protocols, and maybe they don't mind being um, hacked once in a while, or it's just sort of a part of the cost of doing business. I mean, the one thing I would say, being in the field, is there is a sense that, and maybe I'm off on this, but there is a sense that, organizations do feel the reputational damage. They feel that the financial effects of it. They feel the reputation, the security issues. They don't like that. Like, I think, like, Target doesn't like it when their information is breached, right? And so I think there is a sense, I think, almost from a public relations standpoint, that organizations, I think particularly large organizations, don't want to be victims of data breach events. It's bad for their bottom line. It's bad for their reputation. And at least that's my sense of talking to risk managers and organizations like they're. So I mean, it's not to disagree with what you're saying, but my sense, at least from talking to risk managers, is that, you know they don't want a data breach event to occur on their watch, if you will.
Sure. But you also don't want workplace accidents.
Right.
But at the same time, you're going to manage the
Fair.
cost of implementing precautions against that with the benefit, right?
That's fair.
And
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, so okay, but I get your point. The other point is that so you seem to be making the kind of this broad claim based on the interviews, that look, carriers are ineffective at driving firm practices. Like, it just isn't helping either pre-breach or post-breach. And I've certainly felt that also, right? Like, the evidence just doesn't seem to be there. Or at least I thought, and I guess I'm unsure now. So certainly when you talk to carriers and you ask them, hey, are you guys effective at reducing losses? They'll say, oh, absolutely. Look, we just, we notified our customers to patch whatever vulnerability, and they did, and it reduced the losses by 1,000%, and aren't we great? And it's easy to dismiss that by just saying, like, look, you have every incentive to overinflate your claims. On the other hand, I do wonder if they are getting better, if they are making progress in data collection, in data analysis. It's certainly slow, and it's certainly been a squandered opportunity, as far as I can tell. That being said, I do get the sense that they are improving, and I don't, but I can't exactly tell, and I don't know. I can't tell how much, and or even really what to do that, or where to find the evidence.
Right.
And I guess I wonder now if, the interviews and so the research you've collected, if since then the pendulum
Yeah.
is kind of swinging the other way, or at least is directionally going the other way, and if that's a useful story to tell also.
No, I think this is a great point, right? I mean, this market is evolving. I see Tom is in the queue, and he's the one who told me when I started on this project, he's like, "Oh, you got to replicate this study 10 years from now." And I'm saying,
Yeah.
like, well, now I've been working on this almost 10 years, and so I think I'm gonna replicate it again in another 10 years. The market, I think you're right. I think that my sense is there could be some evolution and some learning going on and some improvement. There's certainly more data now. Um, but I think, sort of, can we tell? It's hard to tell, right? As a qualitative researcher, I can tell you that I spoke to many in the field during the window that I studied, which is sort of well, if you really carry it back, it'd be sort of 2014 to 2020. Um, and I feel confident in what I presented to you because I felt saturation in the field. Of course,
Yeah.
when you start hearing the same thing over and over and over again, you can be confident, not that that's what the world is, but that that's what the people are telling you the world is, right?
Sure.
And now, whether that has evolved now, it would require me to go back into the field and really sniff around and kind of flush this out. But there's a certain point where, I have to kind of, I have a publisher that wants a, full draft, so I got to cut the story at some point. And so I think as I evolve my writing on the project, I have to cabin this. I have to address this issue I don't think I can resolve the issue, but I have to cabin the research and qualify it as this is the window in time in which this was conducted, and this world is evolving, and we need to keep studying it. And that's where hopefully that's all part of the knowledge production that academics do. Is one person does research as you do, and then we build on it, right? And so I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that's the way to think about it going forward.
Very good.
Okay,
Thank you. Thanks.
I have Tom Baker next, and then Dave Majeski after that. Tom.
Okay, I have one comment and then a couple of questions. So the comment is really just about the is terminology. Is my sense is that at least when it comes to keeping track of breaches and presenting information about that it's not really big data. It's it's a structured data set where they have a certain number. It's basically a spreadsheet. And so I don't know that big data is really big data is huge unstructured data sets that you can't use for standard statistical techniques on. And I don't think they're to the point where there is big data yet, but that's just a comment. The question a question that we couldn't answer in our research because it wasn't what we were looking at, but I wonder what your thoughts on are two related things. One is that the focus on Dan Schwartz and his co-authors have focused on how so much of the breach response is shrouded in attorney-client privilege, work product, and all that, and so therefore there's not a lot of there's not the ability to learn, and and Anya and I had the intuition, but we couldn't really prove it because that in a way it was sort of a waste because that the privacy harms that these things are protecting against are or to put it that the potential liabilities are so excessive in relation to the actual harm to people that one thing to do would be to just reduce the liability so that there wasn't Dan and Josephine say the answer is to make people share the information and we're wondering whether the answer is just make it not so worrisome to share the information because have the liability be a lot lower. And I'm wondering if you have a view on that fight. And it's not I don't know that it's your fight or your, but what you've talked to a lot of people, you've looked at this a lot. What do you think about that?
So I'll give you a partial answer, which is always another way of saying an unsatisfactory answer. But I ended every interview with the following question: imagine your insurance czar for the day. What one or two changes would you want to make? And again, the vast majority said there should be far more information sharing, data sharing about what's going on, and that this needs to get addressed. And of course, are you insurance company willing to share your data? That becomes a different question. But so there is a sense that there should be more information sharing, and that this will help the market stabilize. This will help carriers. This will help policyholders. This will help brokers stabilize this market so that it isn't so sort of prone to evolution in light of the fact that the cyber criminals are constantly evolving and the threats are constantly changing, and there isn't a lot of lost history to begin with. Again, that's an unsatisfactory answer.
But is the liability, you're not a privacy law person, but is it possible that what's going on is the problem? We've got kind of too much liability about something that's not that big a deal, and so therefore one answer to do something is that the problem isn't. We don't want hacks, we don't want privacy leaks, we don't want other sort of things, but they sort of happen to good companies sort of no matter what they do. And,
right.
Maybe we shouldn't be hitting them with fines that are so hard so that they then protect everything with, attorney kind of privilege and more kind of work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there was some of that I think I heard in the field as well. But I wouldn't say I have enough to make a finding on that. But I think I've heard some of that too. This is an open area, it's a fluid area. So I think people are evolving in how they're thinking about it.
Great. And so I think the last one we have time for is David Majeski.
All right, I'll make my question quick. So this might be a little off topic, but have you seen or do you feel like there's any correlation between the availability of data breach insurance and the incidences of data breaches? So the more it becomes available, the more are you seeing more breaches?
Ah,
The moral
It's
hazard story.
yeah, right. I mean, I feel like I'm not the right person. I don't have the data to answer that question, right? But I think it's a great question. There are a lot of companies that put out these reports annually about these kinds of things. So that would be an interesting. I don't have the answer to that. Yeah, I don't have the data to answer that. I guess would be a cleaner way of saying that. But I think that's a really important question. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up on that? Because it seems like, I mean, Tom and Anya read about this too. A huge part of the problem here is not so much that it's technology, it's that what you're insuring is against strategic risks where it's not like a fire breaks out or a person sues you. It's that everything is endogenous. The people causing these problems are people who are trying to keep ahead of what insurance companies are recommending the precautions be and what companies are recommending their precautions they take and so on. And so that just adds a whole different layer of complexity and feedback loops because every time you recommend something, they're going to be saying, well, okay, we can't do that anymore. We have to do this instead. I'm wondering if that seems like a huge driver, which I didn't really see you mention in the chapters that you shared with us or that you didn't mention in your talk, that there's something special about insuring strategic risks that's different from hurricanes and litigation and stuff like that.
No, I think that's a great point. I know we're running out of time. I don't think I framed it like that, but I do think I think I showed a quote where I think that was the critique of all this reliance on these big data providers that are providing this information. Is it's backward looking, right? Looking in the rear view mirror while the cyber criminals are constantly evolving. And so there is a critique that the data you're actually relying on is not up to date with the evolution of the cyber criminal. So I think that's the way I would finesse that answer, Peter.
That's not a finesse. That's a good response. All right. Well, I would love to keep going. Unfortunately, I have to go teach a class like literally right now, 2 minutes ago. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to just officially call the proceedings to an end. But come back when you finish some more chapters or when the book comes out. We'll celebrate that when the time comes. And thank you so much, Shane, for showing up.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye, everybody. See you in 2 weeks, I hope.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.